So, for our biopsych presentation, we'll be doing Parkinson's disease. This is a video illustration by Suleiman Abdulkadir, Keenan Borde, Violete Perez, and Adam Howard. So, what is Parkinson's disease? According to the Mayo Clinic, Parkinson's disease is a progressive, meaning once you obtain it, it proceeds and it doesn't stop, nervous system disorder that affects the motor system. And these effects on the motor system manifest themselves as stiffness or rigidness and tremors. So we talked a lot about progressive nervous system diseases, but what does all that mean? So for our population here, meaning who's inclined to obtain Parkinson, those are usually the elderly, more males than females, above the age of 60. Our organisms in this case would be human beings, Homo sapiens. Moving further down the levels of biological organization, our organ system, because this is a nervous system disorder, we're going to be focusing on the nervous system as our organ system. The organ specifically would be the brain and spinal cord. So our tissues that make up our nervous system, specifically our brain and spinal cord, would be our nervous tissue. And the basic building block of our nervous tissue would be our nerve cells known as neurons or neuroglia. So what is the background of Parkinson's disease? Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, meaning that we have neurons that degenerate or that don't produce as much neurotransmitters as they should in the system. And this results in motor impairments such as resting tremors, as well as cognitive effects such as psychosis, dementia, anxiety. In addition to these tremors, we can also have slowing of movement and stiffness, which are very common among Parkinson's patients. Though unclear, there are other variables that affect Parkinson's or the risk of developing Parkinson's, such as caffeine, high levels of vitamin D, and the regular use of anti-inflammatory drugs known as NSAIDs. So susceptible populations, as before mentioned, males are more at risk to develop Parkinson's than females, and this is usually in the elderly above the age of 60, though there have been exceptions. There was one intelligent chemistry student in his late 20s who tried to synthesize heroin, but the compound he made, MTTP, actually resulted in Parkinson-like side effects. So this drug resulted in individuals way below the risk rate of Parkinson developing side effects similar to Parkinson's. And the incidence of Parkinson is also much higher in industrialized countries, likely due to heightened exposure to toxins such as pesticides. And aerobic exercise is thought to have the potential to decrease the risk of Parkinson's. So the neuromechanism of Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease includes the progressive loss of dopaminergic neurons. Dopaminergic neurons are neurons that synthesize and release dopamine. These neurons are the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, which we'll talk about later. So because these neurons, we are losing them, this results in a depletion of dopamine in the dorsal striatum. Xenobiotic exposure is said to activate certain Parkinson's disease genes, and a link has been noted between exposure to pesticides and Parkinson's disease, which was further mentioned when we talked about how industrialized countries are more at risk because of their use of toxins. Exposure to metals such as mercury, lead, and manganese have been shown to have an impact on the development of Parkinson's disease via epidemiological studies. Rating these metals, mercury has been shown to be the most toxic. Parkinson's disease patients have an upregulation of oxidative stress, along with the production of reactive oxygen species. Even though Parkinson's disease does not have a cure, there are methods to heal or to reduce the symptoms that manifest. One of these methods is chelation therapy, which is a method to remove the excess metal from the body as a preventative measure to prevent the risk of developing Parkinson. Dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra are particularly sensitive to mercury due to the increased glutamate toxicity, which is why increased mercury leads to a higher risk of developing Parkinson's. So we talked a lot about the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is a collection of structures that affect motor movement. They receive signals from the motor cortex, and they then integrate these signals into the brainstem, which has the option of either going to the cerebellum, where the motor signals are integrated, or it can go directly back into the motor cortex. So showing the structures more in depth, the cortex sends the signals to the striatum, which contains two structures, which are known as the caudate nucleus and the putamen. This striatum receives the synapses from dopaminergic neurons, specifically substantia nigra. So substantia nigra is a structure that synthesizes and releases dopamine. These dopaminergic neurons synapse on the striatum, which also synapses on the globus pallidus. From there, the motor signals have an option of going to the subthalamic nucleus and then returning to the globus pallidus, or they can go directly to the thalamus located in the midbrain and then go up to the cortex. So the basal ganglia is a term referring to a group of structures important both for motor control and for cognitive function. Basal ganglia has associated structures inside the brain, such as the thalamus, which is our motor region, a substantia nigra, which is in the midbrain, which will be shown later on, and a subthalamic nucleus, which stems from the diencephalon. During embryonic development, the brain is divided into 5 segments. The second segment, known as the diencephalon, gives rise to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the substantia nigra is a structure that synthesizes and releases dopaminergic neurons. These neurons synapse and release dopamine at the striatum. Another structure that also synapses and releases dopamine is located adjacent to the substantia nigra, and this is known as the ventral tegmental area. So the ventral tegmental area is located in the midbrain and is situated adjacent to the substantia nigra. Although it contains several different types of neurons, it is primarily characterized by dopaminergic neurons, which project from the ventral tegmental area throughout the brain. Due to these projections, the ventral tegmental area is considered an integral part of a network of structures, together known as the reward system, that are involved in reinforcing behavior. So what are the symptoms that arise from Parkinson's disease? The basal ganglia is separated into 2 parallel circuits, direct and indirect. We're going to mainly focus on the direct circuit in this presentation. A deficit or lesion in this direct pathway leads to hypokinetic or hyperkinetic disorders. From the prefixes, we know hypo is a lack of, while hyper is excessive. So hypokinetic disorders are akinesia, which is initiation of movement is impaired, and bradykinesia, where we have a reduction in the velocity and amplitude of the movement. While a hyperkinetic disorder would be dyskinesia, which is involuntary movement. Tremors would fall into dyskinesia, as they are excessive movements that we have no control over. And stiffness and rigidity would fall into a hypokinetic disorders, because they are movements that are reduced that we want to control but are unable to. We also have cognitive symptoms that arise, such as depression, psychosis, dementia, speech changes, such as hesitation and slurs. There are also writing changes, which are more difficult to diagnose, and this is difficulty writing or visibly smaller handwriting. So here's the direct pathway. Excitatory neurotransmitter would be glutamate, labeled in the green, while inhibitory neurotransmitter will be GABA, labeled in red. So the cortex excites the striatum, which we said includes the caudate nucleus and the putamen, and this further excites the substantia nigra and the GPI. GPI stands for our internal globus pallidus. This in turn inhibits the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, but this inhibition disinhibits the ventrolateral thalamus, which leads to an excitation of the cortex, and it comes all around. So how would we treat the Parkinson's disease? Normally, we would have an adequate amount of dopamine and a counter amount of acetylcholine, and these two will balance themselves out, leading to controlled movement, as illustrated in the diagram above. But because we have a lack of dopaminergic neurons or degeneration of dopaminergic neurons, this leads to a decrease in the amount of dopamine in the system. And this decrease in the amount of dopamine in the system means cholinergic input becomes more prominent. And this prominent cholinergic input is what actually causes the problems in Parkinson's disease. So the leading treatment, our first line of treatment, would be carbidopa and levodopa. Levodopa is the prodrug of dopamine. The reason we use levodopa is because dopamine itself cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So there are 2 ways to get across the blood-brain barrier when a drug is self-grown. You can either inject it directly into the brain, or you can use a prodrug, which will metabolize after crossing the blood-brain barrier. The issue with levodopa or L-dopa is that only 2% of it actually reaches the brain before metabolizing. But if used in adjunct with carbidopa, that 2% amount of levodopa that metabolizes the dopamine increases up to 10% without us changing the dosage amount. A much more effective method at quelling the motor system associated with Parkinson, but dopamine agonists and monoamine oxidase inhibitors also have their advantages. So monoamine oxidases are enzymes that take away neurotransmitters from the cleft. If you inhibit those through monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you're leaving the neurotransmitters in the cleft longer. And this means we have increased duration of dopamine inside the cleft, which doesn't do as much as carbidopa and levodopa, but it still quells it. A dopamine agonist, meaning drugs that increase the amount of dopamine, such as pramexiprazole and propranolol, can be used as monotherapy and as adjuncts to levodopa to treat the bradykinesia, postural instability, and rigidity. So the contributions of this PowerPoint: Suleiman contributed the causes, symptoms, PowerPoint compilation, video editing. Keenan Borde contributed the age of onset and the neural mechanisms, specifically the direct pathway. Violete Perez contributed background, susceptible populations, the accompanying factors and conditions that affect the neural mechanism. Finally, Adam Howard contributed treatments, ranking the different classes in terms of efficiency, first-line treatments, and so on. This will be our first page of our works cited list. Well, this will be our second page for our works cited list. I hope you enjoyed.